I'm James Crump. I'm the director and writer and producer of Troublemakers, a story of land art.
The idea of land art is related to the idea of the globe, especially after the spaceship. The first picture of the Earth gives you the idea that our Earth is an object. So the idea for these artists after 1963 is that you can shape something which is a sphere.
Well, I lived in the Southwest. I lived in New Mexico for over a decade, so I became conversant with some of these sites while living there. But in 2003, while doing research for a previous film project, I did an interview with Michael Heiser, which was somewhat of a rare event. He doesn't talk to many people. He's very reclusive. And the film, in a way, started to gestate there. I got interested in land art before that time, but I made my first journeys to some of those sites that are featured in the film as early as 1995. So I've been thinking about it for a very long time, but really it began to gestate after the Michael Heiser interview. I felt that, in addition to that this was a time to produce the film now because of the state of the contemporary art market. I thought it was the right time to try to rediscover the spirit of these artists and encourage people to go to these sites because they're sometimes overlooked or forgotten about. Yeah, another impetus was the fact that a few of the major players of land art had already passed away. Robert Smithson, Walter D. Maria, Nancy Holt passed away right before we began shooting this film. We asked Michael Heiser, we really tried to reach out to him, encourage him to participate, but he chose not to. So it was a matter of finding really the right archival materials with some of the deceased artists, but also some of the players who were still around or peripheral characters who were very, very close to them. People like Lawrence Weiner, who himself is not really a land artist per se, but is someone who hung out a lot with people like Robert Smithson and Vito Acconci, for instance. So it was a choice of trying to find those principal characters who were really very much involved in that late 1960s scene in New York City, who understood the stakes, understood what these artists were responding to, and were able to kind of fill in the gaps. These artists sought to create works on a monumental scale in the vast and desolate desert spaces of the American Southwest. Today, these works remain impressive for their audacity and ambition. I chose Germano Chalant as the key art historian because I don't really work with talking heads too much. I'm an art historian myself, but Germano spent a lot of time in the late 60s with these artists and in fact, to some extent, adopted them for some of his projects in Europe in the late 1960s, early 70s. So he is I would call him the de facto narrator of the film, but really the only art historian speaking. A lot of the archival footage emanates from public collections. However, there were finds that I made over the years. For instance, the first thing you see in this film is a 16mm clip that I discovered about 15 years ago, and it hadn't been restored at the time I discovered it. And in fact, the owners did not want to share it with me. But I went back a decade or more later and was able to find, be able to use the clip itself. So they came from a variety of sources. The artists themselves, the Smithson Holt estate the people at the Smithson Holt estate were very forthcoming and shared all of the materials that I requested from the historical archives of Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson. So it's a matter of digging. It's art historical research. Sometimes it's serendipity when you find things and you just stumble across them, but you have to be out there digging for them to find them. I think it's a film for the lay person as well as the specialist art historian because it's art historically accurate, but I was really trying to make a very, very immersive and experiential type of motion picture that would appeal to a broad audience. I think also I was trying to make something that I thought was timely for today. We're encountering a very, very highly commodified, hyper-speculative contemporary art market, and again, as I said, I think that in a time when money and value are things that are constantly being discussed about contemporary art, it's interesting to go back to the late 60s, early 70s and rediscover a spirit of artists who were not motivated by those things, trying to build and make and manifest visions that were objects in the desert that you couldn't own or couldn't commodify necessarily. So I thought it was the right time, but to answer the question, yes, it's a picture for the lay audience, but also for specialists in the field. I don't think the land artists were necessarily rebelling. I think that's one aspect. I think they were more or less trying to break free or transcend limitations. That said, I think there are a number of young artists who are really looking at the new parameters of art making, the traditional models, and trying to seek ways to work outside of those traditional models. There's a number of important artists who are considering working in the land today. So there is a legacy, and I think we're at a crucial moment where some really interesting young artists, mid-career, emerging, even late career artists are considering some very, very ambitious projects, which I would consider kind of an extension of the legacy of these artists' work from the late 60s and early 70s. Typically, I don't give advice, but to share my experience, I would say something to the effect that I think for me, having not gone to film school, it was a seat of the pants. If I was flying by the seat of my pants in order to start in filmmaking, learning and developing skills, developing experiences. So I think that one shouldn't be intimidated by not having that film school degree. I come out of the art historical. I come out of an art historical academic background. So if you have a film inside of you, if you have storytelling that you're interested in, pursue it and find out ways to manifest these ideas, because there are ways to do it, especially today with technology that facilitates so much of filmmaking.